Alright, so Dusk. You know it? You love it? Well, actually, you probably don't know it, to be honest, because nobody knows what this game is, but it's really, really good. And recently, they came out with New Blood came out with a HD remaster of Dusk. And so I wanted to go over what some of the changes are that's made by the Dusk HD remaster, whether or not you should play the remaster, and if playing the remaster is instead of the original is a good idea or not. So I think the biggest change to me, so obviously what Dusk HD is a high resolution remaster along with new models. So Dusk obviously has a very 90s retro aesthetic, and the goal of this remaster I think is just to add more detail and visual clarity to the game and just give it a fresh coat of paint. So what it changes are the texture quality as well as the model quality, but there's also some stylistic changes too. It's not just a higher resolution version of the same game. It looks very different, especially when it comes to enemy models. I also noticed there are some changes to lighting too. There's some improvements, I think, to global baked lighting, and also there's additional reflections and particle effects that I don't think were in the original. There are also a handful of level changes that I noticed. I think I noticed two. Specifically one in the room that is at the end of... Oh, which level am I thinking of? Into the Thresher? Maybe that's the name of the song. Anyway, I think it's the second or third level in the second episode. There's some of the crates are lower, and there is also a bigger, the wall is more filled in at the end of, I think level 4 in episode 2. There might have been some other changes that I just didn't notice, but those are the only ones I can think of off the top of my head. And I also went back and played through the original game, and those weren't different. They were the same, so I went back and I played through those specific parts where I noticed something was different in the HD remaster, and they seem to be the same. So I'm not exactly sure why those were changed. Maybe they just wanted to make some improvements to the levels in certain areas, and they just decided to only do it for the remaster. I don't know. But I'm gonna go over some of the big changes. I think the biggest change overall is the enemies. Each of them have completely new models and new animations too, and I think the new animations add a lot to the game. They are a lot more expressive and exaggerated and fluid, and when you combine that with the more detailed, more striking textures and model work, I think it creates for a much more stylized look when it comes to the enemies. Compared to the original. The originals, especially I think the color palette change is a pretty big difference too. At least with the enemies. The regular textures, the level textures are fairly similar to the original game, but they're noticeably smoother. The game doesn't feel quite as gritty, and it just overall has a different look to it. When I was watching the trailer footage, I was a little bit worried that the game was just going to look very smooth, because the texture work really breaks up the flat planes that are all over the maps in Dusk because it has that 90s aesthetic. But playing through the game, at least with the graphical settings I was using, if you don't know, Dusk has a lot of graphical settings. The game it didn't have that overly smooth look that I was worried about. There's some areas that I think do have that, and I definitely think I prefer the grittier texture work of the original for the level models. But the enemy models, I think, are just fantastic. They look, in my opinion, a lot better than the original games, and it's just cool seeing all the detail put into them. They feel more unique individually, and there's just more detail put into them. And another thing that I think is a really big improvement too are the weapon models. They look really, really good, and I've been playing I've played through the entire game on the HD remaster now, and I think the weapon changes might be one of my favorites. They all look fantastic. There's just so much more detail put into them. They just look great. They have this sort of steampunky aesthetic to them that was just kind of missing from the originals because of how simple they were. One thing I did notice with the game is there is some performance issues. At least I noticed some. I usually get like 200-300 FPS in regular Dusk, sometimes dropping down to like 125. But with the remaster, I was getting some stuttering, especially in I think the third episode and second episode. I was getting some stuttering, and I think that just comes down to the game was not optimized for having such high resolution textures, and especially the models. I think because the textures are maybe double resolution. The models, though, are very, very smooth compared to the original. They have a lot more polygons. And I noticed that there's some things in the game that maybe didn't really need to have that much model detail. Like, a great example, like the shotgun shell boxes. Each individual shell has been modeled and they're fully round. Whereas the cars in the game still have totally flat planes on the side. So I think it's kind of weird the areas that they chose to actually improve. But the stuttering wasn't too bad. I mean, it's playable. It's not horrible. Hopefully they'll put out patches to improve it over time. I know they're still working on the game, especially with the modding SDK that they just, like, I don't know if it's still in beta or if it's the Steam Workshop support that they've added that has a couple things in there. Within the first day, someone made a big a penis and uploaded to the workshop, so you know that we're doing good as a community. Other than that, I think the change in art style is a pretty big difference from the original. It just looks a little bit more stylized and cartoony, I guess. That's not a bad thing at all. It's just different from the original game. And so I think, you know, whether should you play Dusk HD instead of regular Dusk, like if you're just looking into the game now and you haven't played it yet, should you play the HD version or the original? Honestly, I say go with the HD version. I think that the improved enemy and weapon textures and models they look really, really good, and I don't think you're missing out on any of the atmosphere at all. I mean, I was playing through the game and I played through it probably way too much in one sitting, and Dusk is a little bit repetitive after a long time, and I've already put 110 hours into the game, I think. So playing through it again I still managed to, you know, it felt the same. Like, it didn't feel like I was playing a worse version of the game at all, or like that the art style was trampling over the original direction of the game. I definitely think that they did a very good job, like as a faithful remaster. I think, like, comparing it to, for example, Halo 1 Combat Evolved Remaster, I think that Dusk does a much, much better job at improving upon the original without trampling over its art style. And if you like Dusk and you haven't played through Dusk HD, definitely go through and play it again. I think it was 100% worth it, and kind of any excuse to play through Dusk again is worth it. Another couple things I noticed, I did mention some lighting changes. There's a couple textures that actually have added some sort of reflection to them. I can only think of one. There's this one meat texture that's found in some of the levels of episode 3, specifically Crypt of the Flesh has this texture a lot, and it's the only texture I've found that actually has just reflectiveness to it. If you remember that one scene where you go inside of the rib cage, I think it appears twice, once in Crypt of the Flesh and actually wait, maybe Crypt of the Flesh, and then once again in one of the later levels when you go back to it. But I did notice there was reflections on there, which I thought that was interesting that they decided to add that. Other than that, that's pretty much the whole of the update. I might do another video going over some mods or something, but I just really enjoyed playing through the HD remaster. I wanted to share my thoughts on that. So yeah, thanks for watching, and bye.